gavel.
Yes, committed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Nice to be with you all on another Tuesday night here in October. We'll start off as we usually do with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everybody would like to stand, if you can. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Just a couple of quick announcements. We are in the dues or due season. Our season runs July 1 through June 30th. So if you have not got your dues in yet, please do so. You can either talk to the man with the Patriot shirt over there, Larry, our treasurer. If you're unsure whether or not you paid your dues, ask Larry. Do not ask me. I have no idea. Larry should know, though. If Larry doesn't know, we're in trouble. But Larry does know. I have a feeling.
Nobody's paid yet.
Nobody. We'll be looking for a new treasurer next year. The holiday dinner is coming up, December 10th. That's a Tuesday at the Century House. So get your tickets in now if you are interested in attending. It's always a great time. The Century House, they do a great job there. It's 6 p.m. at the Century House, December 10th. And to talk to Bob Lytle in the back, should you like to get your tickets in. Just a reminder that these programs are recorded and on YouTube. So Judge Michaud's program on Ben Butler is now up on the YouTube channel. So if you do miss any of our meetings or you're not able to make any of our meetings, you can always watch them on our YouTube channel. And then next month, our meeting is on November 26th. So that is the week of Thanksgiving. So it's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. We'll have Professor John Rodrigue. Jack, help me. Rodrigue? Okay. From Stonehill College. So tonight, though, we are honored, and I am very happy that he agreed to come back and speak with us again. Dr. Tom Nestor from Bridgewater State University. He was one of my advisors while I was at Bridgewater, and certainly a great professor there, and a great educator and teacher, so we're very happy to have him here this evening. Tom is a professor at Bridgewater State University, specializing in the Civil War era. He teaches both U.S. history surveys, antebellum America, and Civil War and Reconstruction, American military and naval history, World War II, and the history of the American South. Dr. Nestor has researched and presented papers on various aspects of the U.S. Army's anti-terror campaign in the Reconstruction South, which I believe is what you spoke on last time that you came and visited us, and is currently at work on an article, tonight's topic, concerning Major General Darius and Couch's performance during the Gettysburg campaign. So without any further ado, Dr. Nestor, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mark. I did not put the mic on yet because I was fearful of being caught with a hot mic, so let me just go ahead and attach this.
We didn't edit anything bad out.
All right, there we go. All right, well, thank you very much. This is a new project that I'm working on here on Darius' couch. And Mark, I thought was going to be my PowerPoint guy, but he left.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
There we go. I want to go ahead.
By the sweets.
I'm going to jump another slide since, real quickly here. I always like to find out from students what interests them in a research project whenever they write a paper in my class. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what brought Couch to my attention. So I moved here to Massachusetts in 2011 to start working at BSU, and I was living in Taunton at the time. And my daughters and I have this tradition where we kind of do the Decoration Day celebration for Memorial Day. So we go and we leave flowers and greenery at the Civil War soldiers' graves in the cemeteries. And so I learned that we had a major general of the Union Army buried in Taunton, which kind of really surprised me. And then I learned more about him when I went over to the Old Colony History Museum. They have a nice collection there of his items. One of the things I got to see that I'd never seen before was actually a McClellan saddle, which I was always interested in figuring out what makes a McClellan saddle so special. so I was able to get a good look at it there. And so that led me to go ahead and start taking a look at Couch's career, and I think it's got tremendous potential. What I'm specifically looking at, I'm going to talk to you about his entire career today and his life today, but what I'm really looking at is his command performance there in the Department of the Susquehanna during the Gettysburg campaign. And I will say that, his command or his efforts maybe had a little bit, lacked a little bit to be desired, but he was in command of emergency troops, 20-day men who were not necessarily the most motivated, not necessarily the best trained, and only served for a very short period of time. So I do think he made valuable contributions to the Gettysburg campaign. I think he made overall very valuable contributions to the Union war effort. And I'd like to just kind of introduce you to him tonight. So, do the next one. All right, so if you can hit it again. Maybe I put too many slides here. So I want to go ahead and give you some background. So he's a member of the West Point class of 1836. That's the class that George McClellan also graduated in. About middle of the class there, number 13 out of 59. And after graduating, like many West Point cadets, was initially breveted as a second lieutenant. For him, it was in the 4th Artillery. And of course, his first experience is going to be in the Mexican-American War. During the Mexican-American War, he was also breveted a first lieutenant for bravery at the Battle of Buena Vista. And then eventually, as you can see from his other experience here, had a very common old Army experience prior to the American Civil War. He spent a lot of time at a variety of different duty stations. Promotions were very slow. When he left, he was actually a full first lieutenant in the 4th Artillery. And as you can see there, he only spends a year or two at a lot of these posts. All right, and so in 1851, when he got to conduct recruits out to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, I think that was just a nice little deviation from the normal routine of serving in the artillery at a lot of these coastal fortifications. Of note, in 1853-54, he applied for detached service, and he conducted an expedition funded and supported by the Smithsonian Institution down to northern Mexico. And Mark, if you can go ahead and just to show you, there are 2 species of animals that he discovered during that northern Mexico expedition that also carry his name. So Couch's kingbird and Couch's spadefoot toad. Yep. No, 4. All right. In 1858, he was stationed at Fort Independence on Castle Island in Boston, and that's where he met his wife. And that's where we start to see a change in his military career. He married a fairly prominent woman from Taunton, Mary Caroline Crocker, who was a member of both the Crocker and the Leonard families. Their families did very well in manufacturing and production in Taunton. Her father was actually a U.S. representative for one term, so they're very well known in Taunton. And throughout Taunton history, I think the first members of the Leonard family go back to the 1600s in Taunton. So he married Mary Caroline on August 31st of 1854, and she does travel with him out to Fort Leavenworth. They are going to have 2 children. I find it interesting that Alice Leavenworth Couch, who was born in Connecticut in 1855, was most likely conceived at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and of course has her middle name being Leavenworth, and of course a son after that. Sadly, their oldest daughter only survived till the age of 28. I don't know why she died. I haven't gotten that far in my research, but that was a little bit disappointing there. I do like this quote. Mary Caroline has some remembrances that are in the Darius Couch collection there at Old Colony History Museum, along with Couch's papers. And one of the quotes that I thought was very interesting is she says that she devoutly hoped that her Army life was over when he left the Army in 1855, but it was ordained to be otherwise when he eventually got dragged back into the military service during the Civil War. In the interim, beginning in 1855 to 1857, he spent time as a merchant in New York City, and eventually he came home to his wife's father's copper manufacturing plant, where they produced copper sheathing, and was living there at the time the Civil War broke out. All right, let me go again. All right, so here's a picture of Darius Couch. Couch's service in the Army of the Potomac, I found it very interesting that he offered his services to the U.S. Army as early as December 31st of 1860. Kind of makes me believe that he was probably looking for a reason, maybe to go back into the Army and his military career, in spite of the fact that his wife maybe did not like Army life so much. He never received a response to that letter from the Army Adjutant General. And eventually, when the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Andrews, sorry, that's Pennsylvania Governor is Curtin. Governor Andrew called upon the formation of Massachusetts militiamen. He led a regiment of the Taunton Light Guards up to Boston, Massachusetts, and he received a commission as a colonel, and he is going to form the 7th Massachusetts Infantry, most of which is composed of men from Bristol County entirely. I found this is pretty interesting. They trained also at Camp Old Colony. I haven't learned as much as I'd like to yet about the 7th Massachusetts Infantry. They are going to be mustered out of service in 1864. So they're a 3-year regiment. I don't know what their re-enlistment rate was. I'm very curious to kind of take a look at that. So I've got a lot of further research, obviously, to do. Couch, when he arrived down in Washington, D.C., his expertise in building fortifications and sighting artillery is going to be utilized in helping to build and lay out the defenses for the nation's capital. He's going to spend, as you can see, July of 1861 to March of 1862 doing that. Of course, George McClellan is going to come to command the Army of the Potomac. He knew Couch. They graduated in the same class from West Point. Even Couch says in his article about Fredericksburg and battles and leaders, he and McClellan were not particularly close. They were certainly not confidants. However, McClellan did have a pretty well-known preference for professional officers to lead his units, and he seems to have tapped Couch, being a West Point graduate, to be a brigadier general. So his promotion came through on August 30th of 1861, but it was backdated to May 17th of 1861. All right. He is going to be given the 1st Division in Erasmus Keyes' 4th Corps on March 13th of 1862, and he's going to have his first experience in combat during the Peninsula Campaign, at least during this war. So during the Peninsula Campaign, we start to see some aspects of Darius Couch that I think show us a lot about the man, about his personality. He is generally very well respected, it seems, by a lot of the men that he served with. He demonstrates personal courage and bravery on several different occasions. But he also reminds me a little bit of McClellan in the sense he maybe has a touch of the slows. He functions very well when he has a commander over him and when he is in a position where he is operating with other Union units in the area. Whenever he's given independent command, he doesn't show the same, let's say, speed or rapidity of his movements. He just doesn't show the same kind of capabilities of an officer when he's in independent command as he does when he's part of the overall army and he's taking instructions from somebody else. And we see that here in the Peninsula Campaign. So one of the early quotes I like from Couch, it is clear that he is kind of thin-skinned. He definitely had a very well-developed sense and concern over his own personal honor and any attempts to impugn that honor. A lot of men, obviously, who commanded during the Civil War had the same feelings. But when Fitzjohn Porter, who's commanding the 5th Corps, complains of soldiers shooting in his rear on the march up to Williamsburg, Virginia, he sent a complaint to Erasmus Keyes rather than Couch directly. That apparently upset Couch because he says, I not only know how to do my duty, but I do it. Right? So in other words, they shouldn't have told my superior that I was allowing or had these problems controlling my men in the field. He should have communicated that to me to be like a respected peer and not someone who had to be commanded to do something. In other words, I think he didn't like being treated like he felt like a volunteer soldier, so to speak. All right? He is someone, interestingly, who is a little bit critical of some of his superiors during the Peninsula Campaign, and he doesn't necessarily say anything negative about McClellan specifically, but he does talk about how the campaign is conducted. Of course, as McClellan starts to march the Army of the Potomac up the peninsula, he moves slowly. He brings along all of his siege equipment, and whenever he encounters some Confederate resistance, he starts digging siege trenches and laying out for a lengthy siege-type campaign. Especially when it came to the Battle of Williamsburg, May 5th of 1862, by the time the Union Army was prepared to attack, the Confederates obviously had retreated, and so they had delayed the Union Army for a significant amount of time. Couch thought this was obviously needless because there were only a few hundred men that held up an army of thousands, and he called it a miserably fought affair. Our people went in by driblets. Now, this is a kind of a consistent problem, I think, for a lot of Union commanders, and it will be for Couch as well, especially at the Battle of Fredericksburg, is not committing the troops all at one time and hitting the enemy with a concentration of force, but instead sending the troops in piecemeal. He sees it and criticizes it when other people do it, but unfortunately, as we're going to see, he does the same thing himself. His first direct combat experience is going to be the Battle of Seven Pines. Obviously, when Joseph Johnston is finally told by Jefferson Davis that you can no longer retreat, you're within 7 miles of Richmond, you have to go and attack the enemy where he is, and he launches this attack against Seven Pines. The 4th Corps was on the other side of the Chickahominy River, so they were exposed, in a very exposed position. Darius Couch refers to as a very faulty position. The Union forces are driven back by the Confederate advance along the Williamsburg Road, and interestingly, they are stopped, and most general officers who were there and present at the time credit Couch's fortifications, the entrenchments that he had been digging, for stopping the Confederate advance short of the Chickahominy River. This was actually done in violation of orders because it was Erasmus Keyes who told him not to waste time digging these entrenchments. But he was certainly happy he did it, because once his inexperienced troops fell back to that position, they certainly had no place else to go with the river at their back, and they fought pretty aggressively to go ahead and stop that Confederate advance. And eventually they're going to be reinforced by Sedgwick's division, right, of the 2nd Corps, that's going to cross the river and support their efforts and get them out of the jam that they were in. During the 7 days battles, Lee's offensive against the Army of the Potomac, which of course drove them all the way back to the James River, mostly Couch's division is involved in supporting operations. One of the biggest efforts that they had in support was covering the Union withdrawal from the White Oak Swamp as they continued their fallback during the 7 days. They do play a significant role at the Battle of Malvern Hill. Couch's division is placed within the line, and as Couch says afterwards in a letter to his wife, that other generals expressed no little praise for the performance of him and his men. And this again is, I think, a great example where when he's fighting from a defensive position, when he's fighting on ground that is superior to what the enemy has, and when he's fighting with his flanks secured to the left and the right, he performs very well in battle. He really kind of knows his job and his responsibility in that kind of situation. When he's more independently operating, he has some trouble. All right. Eventually, obviously, McClellan is going to decide to bring the Union forces back to Harrison's Landing on the Potomac, and this is going to bring Couch's first attempt at resignation. Couch suffered from some sort of illness that he contracted during his time in Mexico. Not exactly sure what the illness was. It seems to have been some kind of gastrointestinal illness that plagued him throughout his life. The picture that I showed, can we go back one, or maybe? Yes, the picture I showed there, I mean, you can tell he's a relatively thin man. He was rather short in stature. But if you compare this to a picture, which I forgot to put in the PowerPoint, unfortunately, but the picture of him at a Union veterans encampment after the war, he looks much more gaunt. So this is something that he periodically struggled with. He will take temporary leaves several times throughout the war. In some cases, it's even been noted that he commanded from a cot his troops, right, when they were in battle because he was so ill. All right, so thank you, Mark. Oh, too far? Am I done? Okay. Oh, so I do like this. McClellan refused to accept his resignation, and of course the guy's trying to leave the army, so let's go ahead and promote him to a major general to make sure he sticks around, right? Okay, good. All right, so he does grant him 20 days of sick leave. Francis Walker, who had been the adjutant general for the 2nd Corps when Couch was in command, referred to him as always in delicate health, right, as I was mentioning before. This is something that he's going to struggle with. Ultimately, two things drive him out of the Army of the Potomac. One is going to be he just detests Joseph Hooker and refuses to serve under him. But you will find that the historians that actually do talk about his reasons for leaving will sometimes flip-flop between, well, it was Hooker versus maybe it was his health. And I would say it's probably equal parts of both. He was certainly, by 1863, looking for some other type of command that did not put him in the field as often or as frequently because it was really detrimental to his health. So he's going to get that 26-day sick leave. Eventually, during the Antietam campaign, I do find this fascinating, McClellan could not stand Erasmus Keyes, the commander of the 4th Corps, and he decides to leave 2 divisions of the 4th Corps at Harrison's Landing when he transports the rest of the Army of the Potomac up to Washington to start contending with, obviously, the Confederate invasion of Maryland and the Second Battle of Bull Run. And so this is a time where we actually do see Couch in independent command, and he does not do particularly well. He's not involved in the fighting at Antietam on September 17th. At that time, he actually is ordered to occupy the position there on Maryland Heights. And of course, everybody's probably familiar here with Confederate General A.P. Hill's effort to get to the battlefield on September 17th and really fortify the Confederate position and drive in the Ninth Corps' attack across Burnside Bridge, right? And one general, Jacob Cox, Union general, said after the battle, Hill came, but Couch did not. Now, there's no clear evidence to indicate that he was actually ordered to the battlefield or that he was given any instructions to get there quickly. Maryland Heights was obviously a strategic position overlooking Harper's Ferry, and so it was a position that the Union forces maybe were not going to want to go ahead and give up very easily. There was no criticism, aside from Jacob Cox's criticism, there was no effort to hold him accountable for failing to come to the battlefield on September 17th. Certainly McClellan doesn't appear to have had any ill will towards him for any slow movements. He will participate in the pursuits of the Potomac September 18th and 19th, and he will continue his upward ascent through the chain of command. So he had been a division commander. When Burnside comes to command the Army of the Potomac, and of course he creates his grand divisions, the former commander of the Second Corps, Sumner, is going to be elevated to the command of the Right Grand Division, which means that his senior subordinate, Darius Couch, is elevated to command of the Second Corps. And it is as commander of the Second Corps that he is going to participate both in the Battle of Fredericksburg and also in the Battle of Chancellorsville. And he plays some pretty prominent roles in both of these battles here. And then later we'll also get to the second attempt at resignation, which will come after the Battle of Chancellorsville. Thank you, Mark. All right, so Battle of Fredericksburg. It's going to be Couch's forces that are chosen to make the frontal attack against Maurice Heights. This is something that Darius Couch says, and he writes the story of the battle that appears in Battles and Leaders after the war, which, if anybody knows, obviously was a massive collection of articles written by Union and Confederate veterans after the Civil War about a lot of the major battles and campaigns of the Seven War. So it's interesting that he was chosen to go ahead and write about the Battle of Fredericksburg. And he is in charge because Sumner puts him in charge. Sumner's Right Grand Division is going to lead this attack against Maurice Heights. He chooses his old corps to go ahead and lead this attack. The Second Corps was probably regarded as one of the better corps in the Army of the Potomac at this time, and that's another reason why Sumner wanted them in the battle. Unfortunately, Couch doesn't do the same thing that his commander did. Rather than choose one of his best units to go ahead and launch the attack, unfortunately, he chooses one of his worst divisions to actually go and lead the attack. And he doesn't send his entire corps in at the same time. He sends them in division by division. French's force attacks the Confederate position at Maurice Heights first. Obviously, it leads to a bloodbath for those Union soldiers. Around the time that French's men are withdrawing and falling back is when Hancock's division is sent in, and not only do they have to fight their way through French's men who are retreating in order to attack the Confederates, they also have to contend with, obviously, the Confederates fighting from behind the sunken road and the wall, obviously, there at Maurice Heights. All right. Eventually, he's also going to send General O.O. Howard's force in. Howard's going to commit his troops regiment by regiment, and obviously, the whole thing is unfortunately going to be very costly for Union forces and not result in the taking of Maurice Heights. Couch says from the very beginning, now of course this is in retrospect, but he says from the very beginning that he tried to talk Burnside out of a frontal attack against this position. He saw the strength of the Confederate position. He did not think it could be easily turned, and he argued in favor of a flank attack instead. And he was overruled and ordered to continue with the attacks. Even halfway through the fighting, he also goes to Burnside again and asks to call off the attacks against Maurice Heights because they're simply too costly, and he's once again denied. He is even going to ask Hooker to go to Burnside and try and talk him out of this, which is kind of ironic considering the relationship those two men are going to have after the Battle of Chancellorsville. He did express that he had little faith, as a lot of men in the Army of the Potomac had, little faith in Burnside's abilities to lead the Army. And he says before the battle, the general expression was against the plan of crossing the river. And as I mentioned, he asked Burnside to halt the attacks. And he says that Burnside plainly intimated that his subordinates had no right to question his orders. So I think this is a time where you can see Burnside doesn't like being questioned by his subordinates and refuses to take the advice of men who were on the field of battle and actually saw the strength of the position firsthand. One thing, just thinking about that story, Battles of Leaders, if I can just use this as a little bit of an aside, he talks about hearing the news that Burnside was going to be appointed to command of the Army of the Potomac. Apparently McClellan and Burnside both rode up to him, and McClellan told Couch that he had been relieved of command and that Burnside was the new commander. And Couch, the way he puts it, says that he went over to McClellan first, extended his hand, shook his hand, and he says, "I'm very sorry for you, General." And then he walked over to Burnside, and he said, extended his hand, shook his hand, and says, "Congratulations, General." He really wasn't particularly close to McClellan, I think, is one of the things. That even though McClellan gave him 2 promotions that were obviously very useful for him in his career, he didn't necessarily have any particularly close relationship with him. All right, so that leads us to the Battle of Chancellorsville and the Chancellorsville campaign. Again, not surprising, a lot of officers had misgivings about Joseph Hooker being appointed to command. They didn't think he was the right man for the job, didn't think he had the temperament for the job. But he does talk about, of course, Hooker starts to reorganize the Army of the Potomac. He starts to make sure that food is delivered on time, that medical care is available, that supplies are available, all the things that Burnside failed to do as an administrator of an army. Hooker is going to be able to do and provide for his men, and the morale gets a significant boost. And of course, one of the other factors I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that leads to an increase of morale is Hooker is going to assign, right, those core identification badges that become so famous in the Army of the Potomac. And this is going to be something that obviously is going to lead the men to take a lot of pride in their unit and have some esprit de corps, at least if you're from a good corps like the 2nd Corps, maybe not from the 11th Corps. But he talks about that this had a magical effect on the Army, and he really is surprised. And you get the sense in reading this from his memoirs that perhaps he was willing to give Hooker a chance in looking at his and evaluating his command of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln comes down to Falmouth, Virginia, and he visits the Army of the Potomac. He inspects it, and this is the first time that Couch is going to be in close proximity to the President of the United States. But this is a time where he is going to speak to the President directly on a few occasions. And one of the things that Lincoln tells both of the men is that when you get into the next battle, put all your men in at once. You know, this is something that, from Lincoln's perspective, obviously the Confederates were able to do it. Robert E. Lee was able to do it. Why wasn't the Union Army able to do it, especially with the manpower advantage that the Union Army had? So it's interesting that he does say this to both men. Couch is the second most senior officer in the Army of the Potomac at this time, all right, which is probably one of the reasons why Lincoln addressed him as well as addressing Hooker on this issue, in case there was ever someone was injured or wounded or a change in command. Of course, for a time, Couch is going to be in temporary command of the Army of the Potomac during the Battle of Chancellorsville, after Hooker gets knocked senseless by the cannonball that struck the wooden pillar on the porch he was standing on. During the Chancellorsville campaign, the 2nd Corps is only going to have 2 out of 3 divisions available to it. So it is going to be weakened. 1 division is left on the north bank of the Rappahannock River. Their task is to give the Confederates the impression that Union soldiers are still in the camps, to deceive them about the movement. You know, maybe seems to me that maybe the 11th Corps would have been a better unit to go ahead and detach a division from. The Flying Dutchman, obviously we know how poorly they're going to perform at Chancellorsville, but he leaves a division of the 2nd Corps there. And in talking about the Union Army's ability to steal a march on the Confederates and get across the Rappahannock River unobserved by the Confederates and catch them really by surprise and be in the rear of Robert E. Lee's army, Couch does call this a brilliantly conceived and executed movement. All right, but he does say that Hooker needed to continue to be aggressive because the actions that got them on the other side of the river could not just stop at crossing the river. Unfortunately, that's exactly what Hooker does. And Couch gets a sense that Hooker is determined to fight from a defensive position. Hooker even says, I chose to fight on ground of my own choosing. But the reality, and this is something that Couch also says in his memoirs, is this was not an ordinary enemy. We were going up against one of the most aggressive, most innovative commanders perhaps in the Civil War. They had already had that experience, and now was no time to grow cautious, so to speak. And there's going to be various times throughout the Battle of Chancellorsville where Couch becomes increasingly convinced that Hooker has lost his nerve. One of those times is when he's leading the Second Corps out east, right, along the Orange Plank Road, east of Chancellorsville. They get roughly 2 miles east of Chancellorsville, and they're on an elevated plateau. And the artilleryman in Couch knows that this is going to be an excellent position from which to stage artillery and contest any Confederate advance coming at them from the town of Fredericksburg. And rather than stay there and entrench themselves in that position, he gets the order from Hooker that they're called back to the Chancellorsville crossroad. And this is a problematic position because obviously when you're there, you're not on the high ground. You now surrender the high ground to the Confederacy, and you're surrounded by a lot of wooded areas. He calls it's a nest of thickets. So you simply can't see the enemy that's coming at you. Artillery doesn't have a clear shot at the enemy. And the enemy artillery eventually is going to have higher ground from which to fire upon the Union position there at the Chancellorsville crossroads. So he thinks this is one of the big mistakes of the battle, and even before most of the fighting actually occurs, just that order to move them back the 2 miles to Chancellorsville has convinced Darius Couch that already Hooker's a whipped man. He's done. So once they fall back to this position, the Second Corps is going to be posted facing east on the federal salient that you see pictured up there. From this position, they're going to be fighting and they're going to be covering the Union withdrawal. So obviously the Confederates, Jackson's flank march hits the 11th Corps, right, unexpectedly and drives them in, sends them pell-mell, and of course starts to collapse the Federal position in upon itself. The Second Corps is going to stand and fight and hold the ground. And in fact, as Federal forces start withdrawing from the salient back towards the Rappahannock River, it's going to be Couch's 2 divisions that are going to hold the Confederates off to allow those Federal forces to retreat. He is commanding pretty effectively at this point, and he is eventually going to receive temporary command of the Army. So it's going to be shortly after, about an hour after or so, that Hooker gets knocked senseless. I mean, knowing what we do now about brain injuries, I mean, the fact the guy is standing there leaning against a pillar on a porch and a cannonball explodes the pillar and throws him to the ground, we know he had at least a concussion and probably a fairly severe one. But at that time, Couch talks about how he rode up, he heard that he had nearly been hit by a cannonball, and he says, I rode up and I saw Hooker mounted, and he looked fine. So I went back to commanding my corps, when he was probably obviously not fine at all. And eventually, obviously, Hooker is going to decide to turn over temporary command of the Army of the Potomac to Couch, because Couch was the second most senior officer in the Army of the Potomac at that point. It's clear that Hooker doesn't really trust Couch necessarily. He is going to leave Couch with very specific instructions on what to do with the Army of the Potomac while he is in temporary command, and Couch is going to follow those instructions to the letter. And it's going to be to withdraw the Army into a strong defensible position and defend the fords back across the Rappahannock River, with the idea of obviously ultimately retreating. And you know, there's nothing, while he has this opportunity, he doesn't do anything to countermand these orders. He doesn't do anything to try and change these things. He's visited by different officers, including George Meade, who tell them that, hey, we haven't lost this battle yet. We shouldn't be looking to cross back over the river. We should be looking to stand and fight. Well, one critic of his, James Biddle in the Army of the Potomac, calls Couch at this point a regular old granny. Now, Robert E. Lee was once called Granny Lee in West Virginia, and look how he turned out. So being called Granny at some point in the war, maybe it's not the worst thing. All right, but they are going to fall back towards U.S. Ford to guard their exit point. They're going to hold a council of war, and interestingly, Couch is one of 2 officers. They're in the minority who are going to vote in favor of a withdrawal across the river. In their mindset, the Army had been beaten. Hooker had been beaten and was a beaten man. Hooker doesn't actually take or follow the majority will from this Council of War. Hooker decides that they're still going to go ahead and pull back across the river, which they ultimately do. Who knows? Perhaps Couch understood that that's what Hooker was thinking about and was just voting that way because he knew that's what Hooker wanted, but he is definitely in the minority. Most of the other commanders are asking to stay and fight, but Hooker's going to withdraw the army. So it's, whoop, we can go. You broke my computer, Mike.
There we go.
There we go, okay. All right, so this leads us to the Generals' Revolt, and Couch is a major player in this, along with Slocum and Sedgwick. They're the ringleaders of this. Couch, being senior, was obviously chosen to be one of the people that was the spokesman. And he is, and this is according to Francis Walker, he was outraged in every nerve and fiber of his being for how the campaign was conducted. I should say, Couch talks about this in Battles and Leaders. On 2 or 3 different occasions, he received orders from Joseph Hooker, and he simply didn't like the way the orders were worded. He didn't like being talked to that way. So he's starting to develop some real serious resentments towards Joseph Hooker. He's going to write to the General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, in Washington, and he's going to talk about the dissatisfaction among the higher officers at Hooker's incomprehensible bad management of the campaign. And I think this is probably why Couch voted the way he did at that Council of War. He simply didn't trust Hooker to command the army or command it effectively. Slocum, while he's gone, is going to circulate a petition, and all the officers involved agree that even though they are all senior to George Gordon Meade, that they will serve under him if he is chosen to replace Hooker by the President of the United States. Now, what gives Couch this access to politicians in Washington and superiors in Washington is he's on another sick leave, right? So this time he's on a 3-week sick leave in Washington, and which was very common with a lot of officers in the Army of the Potomac. Washington was so close. A lot of times they would go and bang on politicians' doors and complain about what was going on in the Army of the Potomac. He's going to meet with Lincoln twice during his time in Washington, and it's at the second meeting on May 22nd where Washington actually offers him command of the Army of the Potomac, and he turns it down. He does not believe that he's in the physical condition to command the Army, and he reiterates that the officers have decided that they prefer to serve under Meade, even though Meade is a junior officer to them. Stephen Sears, who I got to admit is really harshly critical of Darius Couch. I've read a lot of the same materials that Stephen, and I respect Stephen Sears tremendously, but he really says a lot of negative things about Darius Couch, which I find kind of interesting because he certainly doesn't criticize McClellan anywhere near to the extent that he criticizes Couch, or in the same language. But he does say of this offering of the promotion that it was just a courtesy due to him, that Abraham Lincoln didn't really want Couch to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac, wanted him to turn it down, and only offered it to him because he was the second most senior commander after Hooker in the Army of the Potomac. Something I'm going to probably do later on is look, maybe make some arguments about whether or not these perspectives are accurate. All right. Ultimately, believing that no command change was forthcoming, Couch is going to apply to resign from command of the Second Corps, and on this occasion, that resignation is going to be accepted. It's pretty clear, I think, that Lincoln and Stanton, the Secretary of War, are really kind of fed up with all the infighting in the officer corps of the Army of the Potomac, and anybody that showed discontent was somebody whose resignation was likely to be accepted. So ultimately, on this occasion, Couch's resignation is accepted, but he's going to be quickly reassigned to a new command. When Robert E. Lee invades Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863, the federal government is going to respond to this invasion and to appeals from the governor of Pennsylvania to create 2 new military departments, the Department of the Susquehanna and the Department of the Monongahela. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Pennsylvania. I should put a map in here. But Johnstown, Pennsylvania is essentially the dividing line between these 2 commands. So the Department of the Monongahela was mostly responsible for western Pennsylvania, really Pittsburgh west. The Department of the Susquehanna was actually a much larger command and entailed everything east of Pennsylvania up to and including Harrisburg, right, the Susquehanna River. All right. Boy, you can't get a good help these days. All right, there we go. All right, so on to the Gettysburg campaign. So it's on June 11th of 1863 that he's given this command. Couch was basically near at hand, right? And somebody that they could put in this position who might be able to command respect. His performance, it's hard to know if his performance was impacted by the emergency troops that he had to command or maybe his own personal failings. He is going to remain in this command all the way through 1864. He's going to become embroiled in Pennsylvania politics, which is eventually going to lead to his removal. He's also going to wind up in kind of a bitter feud with Secretary of War Stanton, which I will also talk about in the coming PowerPoint. So all of this is going to lead to his reassignment, but he's going to stay in command of the Department of Susquehanna for roughly a little over a year, all right, before he's ultimately reassigned. In looking at his performance here at Gettysburg, and I'll be honest, I'm a Pennsylvania native. For me, so much has been written about the Battle of Gettysburg. So many good things have been written about the Battle of Gettysburg, including Stephen Sears' book on the Battle of Gettysburg. There's nothing I could write that's going to surpass anything that's already out there. So I was looking for some kind of niche, which will allow me to go ahead and look at the Gettysburg campaign in a way that maybe people haven't looked at very closely before. So that's why I'm focusing here on Couch and his performance in command of the Department of the Susquehanna. In the early going in the campaign, when the Confederates are invading Pennsylvania and the Army of the Potomac is relatively slow to respond to their movements and has no idea what their intentions are or where they're going. This is where I see Darius Couch playing a pretty big role in the campaign. I think he does two things that are vitally important. Number one, he provides intelligence to George Gordon Meade about where the Confederate Army is, in which direction it's moving. Many of these reports were corroborated by evidence that was also provided by civilians in Pennsylvania. So George Gordon Meade was getting his most effective intelligence on what the Confederates were doing from Darius Couch and his observations. And basically, Darius Couch's militiamen and their observations. They might have not been very effective fighters, but they could certainly look, right, stay far away, observe what the Confederates were doing, and report accurately on what was going on. And this is something that Meade, probably based on their relationship in the Army of the Potomac, and basically I think because a lot of officers respected Couch's command abilities and his courage. One of the things he does at Fredericksburg is, in order to embolden his men, he rides on horseback in front of his troops' lines to try and instill some courage in them after a very heavy day of fighting. So he had tremendous personal courage, like a lot of these individuals had. And I think Meade certainly trusted him and the information he was getting from a fellow professional officer. All right. So one of the things he says in writing to Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, he says, "I shall rely upon General Couch, holding him, Lee, until I can fall upon his rear." Now, this is a lot to ask of Darius Couch, because they're calling for emergency troops to be formed. Pennsylvania was unfortunately very slow to respond for its own defense. Mobilizing these troops is something that's going to require days, even several weeks. Getting them equipped and certainly training is going to be something that's really beyond their capabilities. It's sad to say, as a Pennsylvanian, it's sad for me to say, but New York and New Jersey responded faster in providing troops for Pennsylvania's defense than Pennsylvania itself seems to have done. He will eventually have a command that numbers roughly 30,000 men, but they are all green, raw troops who have very little training, and they resist any commitment to the Union Army for a longer period of time than the 120 days or until as long as the emergency lasts, which they had agreed to serve for. All right. His biggest ally in keeping Lee isolated and in a position west of the Susquehanna River is going to be the river itself, as we're going to see. All right. He does understand that for the Confederates, this is also a massive foraging expedition. Obviously, everybody knows what happened in Maryland in 1862. It's no surprise that the Confederates are going to try to consume whatever they consume, gather up cattle, supplies, whatever they can get to help supply their forces. And of course, that was one of the objectives of Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, was to gather up all these supplies and all this forage and all the horses and livestock and send them down south. Also, I do want to just mention, They're also going to round up over 400 black Pennsylvanians and send them back into slavery in Virginia, which I always point to my students as one of those things that if we really want to question what the Civil War is about for the Confederacy, the fact that their first objective upon entering Pennsylvania was rounding up black Pennsylvanians and forcing them into slavery tells us a lot about their commitment to slavery and what they were really fighting for, in my opinion. All right. He is going to clear the Cumberland Valley of cattle and horses as much as possible to deny this to the enemy, which I think is a very valuable thing that he did. And he's going to try to turn this rabble, so to speak, that's being given to him, provided by him, these emergency troops, into an army as quickly as possible. He understands that soldiers who are poorly trained fight better from behind fortifications or entrenchments. And that's one of the things that he's going to start to do, is construct these fortifications and entrenchments close to the Susquehanna River, defending the crossing points. One of them is going to be at Wrightsville, Pennsylvania. The other one is going to be at Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, directly across from Harrisburg. And this is where he's going to do some very important work in building up these trenches. All right. He does say about training these men, it's more exhausting than fighting. It's almost better to have experienced troops in the field. And he also says to the Confederates, if they but only knew my weakness, all right, they certainly would have pushed harder across the river. Halleck orders him to hold the enemy in check on the Susquehanna, and this is what ultimately is going to lead to the burning of the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge, which I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things that he does say in a letter to Halleck, he says that his intention is ultimately, if he cannot hold the Confederate army at the Susquehanna River, he will eventually take his army and fall back into the mountains to defend the coal regions, because he thinks this is a vital resource for the Federal forces and he wants to deny it to the Confederates. So the decision to burn the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge, as you can see here, obviously you've got these two wings of the Confederate Army. You got Early's forces marching here, Ewell marching up towards Harrisburg, but Wrightsville is right there on the right-hand side of the page. This is kind of a really interesting bridge, and I will also say I love seeing sites where there is still some history that exists, where there's still some physical artifact that's in place. And the stone piers of the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge still exist in the Susquehanna River. The new bridge is built right alongside of it, so it's really interesting to kind of see. There was a tremendous span, 5,620 feet, and it was a covered bridge. So it's the world's longest covered bridge at that time. All right, it was not easy to destroy either. General John Gordon's brigade, along with a cavalry detachment and one artillery battery, is being ordered by Early to push on from York, Pennsylvania to Wrightsville in an effort to secure the bridge. Now, Lee's orders were to actually destroy the bridge, but Early is determined to hold it and possess it just in case orders change and we might have an opportunity to cross over. John Gordon, in one of his reminiscences, says that his goal was to get across the bridge and perhaps push on to threaten Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia itself. All right? So, ultimately, they're going to go ahead on the west bank, the west entrance to the bridge. They're going to go ahead and they're going to dig entrenchments to defend the town of Wrightsville. These are trenches that are basically in a semicircle with the two flanks anchored on the riverbank of the Susquehanna River, trying to defend this. When they encounter Gordon's forces, they're going to fight for roughly 30 minutes, but the infantry is unfortunately not supported by artillery. They have 3 artillery pieces. They have 2 12-pounder Napoleon cannons, and they have 1 3-inch ordnance rifle. Both of them are on the east bank of the Susquehanna River, aimed at the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge in case the Confederates get across to try and destroy the bridge. The infantry don't have any artillery support. The Confederates actually do have 4 artillery pieces, and they're going to use them very effectively. When they start to get under pressure, under artillery fire, on rifle fire by the Confederate forces, unfortunately the militiamen spend more time ducking behind their earthworks than they do returning fire. They are eventually going to run across the bridge once the order is given to retreat, and they're going to flee pell-mell across the bridge. Demolitions had been prepared roughly 800 feet away from the west bank. They had started to prepare to demolish the bridge. This bridge was very sturdy, very well built. There was a lot of timber holding this thing up. And they try to use some TNT to blow it up, and about the only thing they do is they blow up the roof and the walls, but the bridge remains intact. They're going to use coal, oil, and kerosene to set the bridge on fire. So there you go. There is a sketch from Harper's Weekly, I believe, of the burning of the Wrightsville-Columbia Bridge. If you can go ahead and me again. There, right here, again, I just love when history still exists. There's a placard right off the highway there, but there are the stone piers, which you can still see today that still exist there in the Susquehanna River. I went to school not too far north of this at Susquehanna University, and my grandfather grew up in Duncannon, Pennsylvania, which is at the confluence of the Susquehanna and the Juniata Rivers. And one of the things I'll never forget my grandfather always told me, the Susquehanna is a very wide but a relatively shallow river, but it's still very dangerous to cross. People drown there almost every summer who go out and wade into the river because there's sinkholes and things like that in the river. So it is actually very dangerous to cross, not something you want to ford very easily. All right. Further north, there is going to be an effort to cross at Harrisburg by Early's forces. There's the monument that exists to Fort Couch and Fort Washington. These are the two largest earthen fortifications that were built by Couch's forces. One of the things he did have ready access to was Pennsylvania miners, who were pretty good diggers, I guess, because they were able to throw up these earthworks pretty quickly. Pretty sophisticated. It was on the west bank of the Susquehanna River at Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, roughly 2 miles west of Harrisburg. Two companies of Confederate cavalry from Early's Ewell's Corps are going to test the defenses on June 29th. Early is planning a much larger attack against both Fort Couch and Fort Washington. And about the time he's getting ready to order the attack to launch is when he gets the order from Lee to concentrate around Cashtown. Because Lee has found out that the Army of the Potomac is further north than he believed it to be, and he wanted to have his army concentrate and be ready for any battle that might come. Interestingly, though, that there is going to be an attack against some Confederate forces at a place called Sporting Hill. This is by division, so Baldy Smith is going to be under Couch's command, so some of his forces are going to attack those Confederate cavalrymen at Sporting Hill. This is the northernmost battle of the Gettysburg campaign. More of a fun fact than anything else, not a significant battle. So in the Gettysburg campaign, one of the things I wanted to look for, and so far I have not found it, I'll admit I applied for sabbatical next fall to do extensive research on this project beyond what is in the published records and in the OR, things of that nature. So I look at some other things, especially when you get down to the Pennsylvania archives. And see us involved in PA politics. But I thought maybe there might have been some concern on Lee's part about having a large number of emergency troops potentially threatening his rear areas. And that might have factored into his decision to retreat after the third day at Gettysburg. But ultimately, there's been no evidence that I've been able to uncover that there was any fear. In fact, the only thing that we really see is that Couch says the temper and discipline of the force was such that I did not dare risk them in open battle. Meade actually does call upon Couch to send his men out there to threaten to cut off the Confederate line of retreat. He does send Baldy Smith's division out there to guard some of the passes through the mountains, but unfortunately they do really nothing that is going to hinder the Confederate retreat that obviously begins on the evening of July 4th and July 5th. All right. Couch has roughly 9,000 militiamen and 8 guns with him, and he never moved any further south than Greencastle. I thought this might be more visible, but right up here is Greencastle. Down here is Falling Waters. So obviously they were not anywhere near threatening the Confederate army from actually falling across the river. They're going to round up over 1,300 Confederate prisoners. This is a mixture of armed men, unarmed men, wounded men, deserters. Certainly not the cream of the crop of the Confederate army. Meade does decline bringing Couch's militia into the Federal lines around Falling Waters. He actually sends a letter to Halleck and he says, these guys are good for nothing, they spread bad morale, and all they do is eat up our supplies. We don't have any use for them here. And so he does order Baldy Smith's division back to Gettysburg to secure the battlefield and secure government property and to guard the hospitals. And this is something that Couch and his men are also going to contribute to doing. I also just wanted to mention, I'm sure everybody's familiar with Lincoln's famous unsent letter to George Meade expressing his disgust that the Confederate forces had not been destroyed, right, while they were still in the North and were allowed to cross the Potomac River without any further attack. Lincoln does mention Couch and Baldy Smith specifically, along with Meade. So he's very disillusioned with all of them and their performance in this. But of course, he doesn't send the letter because he thinks better of actually doing so. So, when he's there in the battlefield there at Gettysburg, his wife volunteers in the hospitals. I thought this was kind of a poignant quote from her. She says, "The Battle of Gettysburg was a fearful one. I visited the battleground a day or two after the battle, but I cannot describe it. It was too horrible." Which we can only imagine, obviously, how horrible the scene was. Couch's force is going to stay on hand in Gettysburg, and Couch himself is going to stay on hand in Gettysburg all the way up through the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. He is going to command the troops at the dedication ceremony on November 19th, 1863. This is the famous sketch here, the famous photograph here that was taken. I just, see? Okay. Here, so here's Abraham Lincoln, right? It was kind of a fuzzy. I'm sure you've seen the original of this picture. It's pretty fuzzy. That guy right there looks a lot like Darius Couch to me. All right, I can't say specifically that he was. I'm not William Facinito. I haven't done a lot of photograph expertise or anything like that. But I do believe that could potentially be Darius Couch there. He was certainly by the president's side as he escorted them throughout the day's events. And he was standing there when Abraham Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg address. It's after the Battle of Gettysburg through 1864 where we start to see an evolving dispute with the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. It seems to me that he had a fairly good relationship with Stanton earlier on, but that eventually, unfortunately, deteriorated over time. A lot of officers had a deteriorating relationship with Edwin Stanton. And I find some of Couch's involvement in some of the events in Pennsylvania interesting. I mean, as Mark mentioned, I have studied the 7th U.S. Cavalry and their peacekeeping operations in the Reconstruction South. The Army's involvement in, labor disputes, right, political disputes and things like that interests me, and he gets involved in all of these in Pennsylvania. When it comes to labor disturbances in the coal region to prevent any worker strikes, he does say that during this time he did not receive a single order from Washington. So this was his criticism of Stanton and Lincoln for not offering him any guidance in what is a very difficult position for a career military man to be in. How do I use military forces to police my own people, right, during peacetime? Obviously, well, not peacetime at home, obviously. And so it's a difficult thing. He is also asked to investigate some allegations about what was going on at a recruit depot around Pittsburgh. The depot was run by General W.T.H. Brooks. And ultimately, Couch's investigation reveals that Brooks was not guilty of any wrongdoing, that in fact he was crushed by a secretary who did not scruple to try to destroy the military character of the very best officers the war had produced. We can almost get the sense that Couch is referring to himself here. I'm not sure if we're really the very best officers the war has produced, but maybe a little bit of taking too much credit there. He is going to be criticized, somewhat ironically, that Couch's command headquarters was in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, at the time that Confederate forces burnt Chambersburg. They decided to abandon the town. They only had 100 soldiers still under his command. That's how many men were in the Department of the Susquehanna. Is a little over 100 soldiers under his command. So there wasn't much he could really do to stop the attack against Chambersburg. He did say that he blames the Pennsylvania state government, so against my earnest solicitations, the government did not take the actions necessary to prevent the Confederate invasion of the state again in 1864, and he says he had all but a handful of men. And I found his wife's comments pretty interesting. He said, no one thought the city would be burned. Burned, only ransacked, so almost justifying their decision to go ahead and give it up. Simon Cameron is going to come into a feud. So obviously he's the former Secretary of War, Pennsylvania politician. He had been a candidate for the Republican presidential candidacy in 1860. This is one of the things that gave him the position in the cabinet as the Secretary of War, was that he ultimately stepped down from his candidacy so Lincoln could be elected. And his running of the War Department was probably one of the most corrupt that we've seen during the 19th century. Pretty corrupt time period too. Ultimately, that's going to get him ousted from Pennsylvania. He gets sent to Nashville, Tennessee to serve with General Thomas in the defense of that city against John Bell Hood's Confederate forces. Initially, because of his senior rank, he is given command of a corps, the 23rd Corps, and apparently instructions came from Washington that he was not allowed to command a corps, he could only command a division. And he suspected and blamed Secretary of War Stanton for making that order. Right? He does serve well, like a lot of kind of officers who maybe failed out of the Army of the Potomac. He is going to serve pretty well in the Western Theater. He serves well in the battle for Nashville, and eventually his division is going to be transported to North Carolina to support operations. They're mostly going to spend their time defending railroad lines, supporting the logistics for the Union Army. I know I'm kind of, all right, so almost done here, but his post-war career is kind of interesting. He is a Democrat. He is going to be the Democratic candidate for Massachusetts governor in 1865. He's obviously not elected. He is going to be the U.S. Collector of Customs for the Port of Boston from 66 to 67. His Senate confirmation was refused, all right, at that time. He will then become a carpetbagger, right, by running a business down in Virginia. And he will end his career, again, military service in the Connecticut State Militia, first as a Quartermaster General, then as the Adjutant General. He will also serve as the President of the Board of Trustees for a home for disabled soldiers in Connecticut, and finally as a Burgess of Norwalk, Connecticut. He will, as we were looking for, my fiance's back there, we were looking for his records in Massachusetts, but all of his probate stuff was in Connecticut, so unfortunately we're not able to find that here, but I'm going to have to check that out in Connecticut and see how I might. But his son was living here in Taunton, Massachusetts still, and that's how all of his materials wound up at the Old Colony History Museum. Not only just his personal effects, but also his paper documents and records. Quite a useful resource. And it's nice to not have to travel far to actually get into an archive and look through historic documents. So it really was quite enjoyable. So that's all I got. Another thing too, this is Darius Couch being depicted here. This is the South Carolina governor, but that's Darius Couch. This is at the political rally in 1866 that was supposed to drum up support for Andrew Johnson's presidency and his potential candidacy as a National Union candidate in the next presidential election, which obviously did not turn out well. And a lot of Northerners kind of view him as maybe a little bit, I think this is also where people have a negative view of maybe his military career. The fact that he was a Democrat after the war, maybe they question some of his political loyalties. Sorry. All right, any questions? I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
Didn't Couch have a home in Taunton?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, see, Mark Bales, right behind the house here. That's right, I'm off camera now, hopefully.
Kind of.
This isn't really operator error, this really is true, it's not skipping ahead. Here we go. I had the picture in his, where's that? Yep, that's, there it is, right there. So 6 Pleasant Street. So there's, right over there is the Taunton Public Library on that side, and this is the Massachusetts Trial Court right here. So they were law offices, and then I think they sold the building, and maybe it's some other commercial property right now for rent. But yeah, that's the home they lived in before the war.
I look at that regularly.
Do you? Yeah.
Out of my window. Yeah, I never knew it was his house.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yes.
Have you ever utilized John Banks as a contact for information about Darius Couch?
No, who's John Banks?
He does a blog on Antietam.
Oh, okay.
And he apparently works in Connecticut
Okay.
for like the Worldwide Wrestling Federation or something.
Okay.
And into the 16th Connecticut, the 8th Connecticut regiments.
Okay.
And he's done a lot of research on Connecticut.
All right. No, I'll definitely have to look at that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At I'll be honest with you, the staff at the Old Colony History Museum has been really useful. One of my former colleagues at BSU, Bill Hanna. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Bill Hanna. He's a wonderful local historian, especially up in Taunton. But he directed me to a lot of these materials at the time. The archivist up there, Bronson's just been fantastic for him, but I'll have to definitely look for that blog. Yeah. Yes?
Thought it was kind of an interesting, different slant, that he was interested in frogs, salamanders.
Yeah.
And I was like, where did this come from? Was this a lifelong?
I'm not sure. It's the only evidence. I mean, there's only this one moment that he engaged in this kind of work. I haven't found any of it in his post-war career. He's actually referred to by one website as a naturalist, which I thought was kind of interesting for a military man. I don't know. I would like to find out. That's why I want to look at more of his service records down there at the National Archives to see if there's a letter in there that maybe, in requesting to leave, and maybe look at the Smithsonian Institution and see what documents they might have on how he wound up in this position. He certainly was a Mexican War veteran, so I don't know yet if he encouraged the expedition or if they just chose him because of his knowledge of the area, perhaps from his previous service. I assume he had this scientific interest because he definitely seems to have done a pretty good job of finding these species that nobody knew existed before. So,
Now he has a Latin name too.
Yeah.
Is there any, what happened to the family business? Do you know?
No, I don't know. No, that's something.
Yeah.
I have to get into. I want to learn more about the Leonard and Crockett families. They may have materials there. I'm not entirely sure. But it would be interesting because obviously he left the business, and I don't know what happened to it. After that.
The son took it.
Yeah, maybe his son. Yeah.
He stayed in Taunton.
Yeah. I kind of wonder about their relationship too. The fact that he just donated all his father's Civil War stuff after he passed, that's a great way to make sure more people can enjoy it.
Right.
But I wonder if it was that was the reason, or if it was just maybe there was a poor relationship there. Maybe I don't know. Might be something to look into.
Maybe a journal by Crocker or a couch.
Yeah.
Couch, maybe.
Yeah, I would like to know how it is that he and his wife met. I mean, obviously he was probably spending time socializing in Boston. And I guess she probably was, and she was a woman that came from a family of means. So I assume that put her up in Boston periodically. I don't know how often, but it would be interesting to know how they met.
They were at the top of the invitee lists for all of the society halls and such.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Tom Burnside met his wife.
Oh, yeah?
He was stationed at Fort Adams in Newport.
Oh,
He
well.
was invited to several parties in Providence.
Oh, nice. Interesting.
So they earned their money the old-fashioned way.
Yeah. Married into it?
Married.
Married into it.
That was excellent, though.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
I will
you.
just say, there's still a lot of research to do, so my conclusions are rather tentative at this point.
I look forward to it. Are you gonna publish on this, do you think, at some point?
Yeah, my goal, I don't think it's a book-length project. Perhaps maybe it is, but I do think I would like to publish a journal article. It would satisfy my superiors if it was a scholarly academic journal, but even like the Pennsylvania State Journal, I think, if we get into Pennsylvania politics, I might look at that. But I also think it could be something maybe potentially for a Civil War Monitor or something like that. I think it's an interesting story.
Yeah, definitely.
Book raffle time.